Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the AlphaList podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby, and I'm really honored to have Shyam Sankar, the CTO of Palantir, here today with me in the podcast. And we are talking about how and why Shyam will deprecate backend programming in the few years from now. And for the ones who don't know Palantir, it almost got like 70 billion in market cap. That's really crazy on the NASDAQ. And I think most people here know it from, or most people here don't know it. Like Shyam, I hope you're going to tell us more about like what you do and how, because you're working a lot for big corporations and governments as well. And most people think you're doing basically purely data analytics, and you're doing much more. And we're talking today about that, and also about your experience as a CTO, etc. So welcome to the podcast, Shyam.
Well, thank you for having me, Tobias. It's great to be here.
So maybe we start a little earlier in your career. I think you've been like the 5th employee of Palantir, or no, the 13th employee of Palantir?
13th, yeah. Lucky number 13, at least for me. I joined Palantir almost 19 years ago. Really, I was the first person who was not working full-time on the code base. I don't think they thought my code was high enough quality. They didn't want me to pollute it. But I started and built the team of 4 deployed engineers as we began to call the practice of people who would go engage with the customer in the field and actually rapidly prototype solutions, identify the gaps. And it was an outgrowth of Alex Karp's, our CEO's philosophy that, one of the reasons that French restaurants are so good is that the wait staff is actually part of the kitchen staff. They have a deep and intimate understanding of the food and how to manipulate the food in order to deliver the experience. And we wanted to build something much more like that than a commodity way of throwing software over the shelf, over the wall, assuming it would work or not work, and have a much more intimate relationship with both our software, our customers' problems, and our customers themselves.
Okay, so you're in the kitchen and you're out there in the field.
That's right.
Great, but maybe a little earlier, beforehand, like, why did you actually get into computing? Like, why are you, like, I don't know if you still consider yourself a nerd or a geek. why are you one?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know. Maybe there's kind of a metaphysical sense in which you're kind of born that way. But, my dad would always try to get me, even though he could barely afford it, some sort of latest gadget to play with. I remember having access to like a Commodore 64 and, going over to my friends' houses and trying to program them. I was profoundly affected. I grew up in the shadow of the Space Coast in Florida. So when the shuttles would launch in elementary school, you would go out to the courtyard and you can actually watch the shuttle, and when the shuttle would re-enter, usually it seemed somehow karmically it'd always be Saturday morning at 6 a.m. You would wake up to the double sonic booms of its reentry. And so there was this definite optimism that was just you were imbued with of what humans can do with technology and why this would be something that you want to spend all your time working on.
So you found yourself like curious about how to build software for the shuttle then at a certain point, or?
Well, all of the above. I think software is one of the most accessible, easily manipulated. You're not going to build a rocket in your backyard, likely, or at least maybe baby Elon could. But, I think having access to pushing technology frontiers through software. I remember in 7th grade building a simple version of Scorched Earth, that game where you'd be shooting tanks and getting to play with like trig and some basic geometry and encoding that into BASIC at the time.
So basically, you started off with BASIC then, and
Went from there.
10 print hello, 20 go to 10. and from there, like what did you studied IT or?
Yeah, in college, the hubris of youth, I spent my high schools as a programmer. So I felt like, okay, I know enough of this computer science stuff, which I definitely did not, but the hubris of youth. So in college, I spent all my time as electrical engineer, really getting into the hardware with a focus on digital signal processing and electronic waveforms, which was quite useful. I think quite useful in this moment in particular, because I think as we approach leveraging LLMs, I think it's closer to the revolution from analog computing to digital than people realize. And we're operating as if we're already in a digital world. And there's a lot of, fundamentally, we model what's going on in the CPU as digital, but really it is an analog. There's an analog signal that's going through there that we've done a huge amount of engineering to, so that we have this wonderful abstraction of 0 and 1. I think we're going to go through the same sort of process with LLMs. I digress a little bit, though. But yeah, in college, I spent a lot of time as an electrical engineer. After college, really, when I graduated from Cornell, almost no startups were recruiting there. Google didn't even recruit at Cornell when I graduated. So I headed out to the West Coast. I went and did a master's at Stanford as a way of getting to the Valley. Within 2 months of being in the Valley, I had a full-time job at a startup as the 5th employee, a company called Zoom with an X that had been seed funded by Peter Thiel and had just raised its Series A from Sequoia. And I was off to the races. So I did that for about 3 years before joining Palantir in 2006.
So that's basically where Peter Thiel discovered you then, or how did that go?
Yeah, that might be an overstatement, but that's where I started getting the gamma radiation from the PayPal mafia would be a more accurate representation.
So you consider yourself as part of the PayPal mafia then, or?
I consider myself as someone who learns, voraciously from that mafia, but I'm a generation beyond, unfortunately. But I do consider myself part of the founding part of the Palantir mafia for sure.
So I'd be curious how your day looks like. Like, I mean, do you have, I don't know, lunch with Elon every once in a while, or meet Peter Thiel every few weeks, or how does that look like?
Well, certainly at board meetings and things like that. But look, I'm in the trenches. I consider myself someone with my sleeves rolled up in the engine room with grease on my elbows. I'm trying to visit as many customers as often as possible, not to tell them about the roadmap that's to come, but actually to discover what roadmap ought to come. What are the empirical gaps I'm observing in the field that I know we can solve and that we should be organizing around? And how do I synthesize that information? And I spend a lot of time with our teams looking at what they're thinking about and how it's coming together. So that interface, I almost think about it as like the kind of very product aspect of what's happening in the engineering org and the engineering part of what's happening in the field.
Okay, and on the engineering part, like when was your last Git commit?
Oh, that's embarrassing. I don't think they really let me. Yeah, no. That's yeah. I won't humiliate myself by saying.
Okay, so that's a while ago, but I think it's also a fundamental shift that more and more technologists these days are pivoting to product and see how much value they can generate on the product side and potentially on the sales side, right? I think that's one of the things you're advocating for as well, right? That it can be productive if engineers end up in sales. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, we would kind of bristle at the word sales. What does that mean exactly? Yeah. Like our kind of macro critique, certainly my critique would be that, most software is thin. That unfortunately, the strongest argument to push engineers closer to sales is that most software companies seem to somehow be designed sales first. Like, what is the box that we think we can sell? Oh, let's go build that box. Versus what needs to exist in the world to create fundamental value? Why shouldn't we build that? And yeah, it might be hard and messy and complicated to figure out how to sell it, but that, you got to create the value first. And my lived experience with this is like, over the 20 roughly years I've been here, there's always been some company that was going to make Palantir relevant. And it never did. There's probably been 6 or 7 waves of that where investors are like, okay, you're done now. And it's this deep commitment to continually pushing the frontiers, the product perimeter, that you can only observe empirically in the field when you don't define yourself by what box you're in, but what boxes don't exist that the world absolutely needs.
What you explained initially, basically, first see what needs to be solved and then build it. isn't that like more like the European way of doing things, while like selling first and then building the product is more the American way? Like, no offense, but that's how I, as a European, somehow see it. Like we Europeans were so obsessed with, I don't know, especially Germans, like spending time in engineering, building something that might or might not be needed, while Americans often have an attitude of selling quicker and spending time with the client. And I think like the real or reality or the how it should be is somehow in the middle from my perspective.
That's exactly it. It's dialectical, right? So, the opposite of one mistake is another mistake. You need to somehow manage to hold the contradiction. And I think that's one of the deeper lessons. Like, there are many valuable things about having a philosopher CEO, but this is one of them, understanding Hegel's important role in creating businesses. I think that's a more profound truth that engineers tend to struggle with in general, which is like all the value comes from the contradiction. And your attempt to eliminate the contradiction, like, should we do A or B? These seems to be in opposition to each other. The answer is you have to do A and B. And what makes you a really special company is that you can find a way to do both. You can hold that contradiction.
Okay. So what makes you a special company?
I think all the value we create comes from this managed misalignment between our forward deployed engineering teams and our product engineering teams. I kind of think about it as vector math. And it kind of comes from this observation that there really are, as a caricature, two types of engineers, and this is a caricature, but I think it's illustrative. You have engineers who are artists, that their fundamental joy in life is what they created and how beautifully they created it, not its utility to the world. Like, the architecture is perfect. The fact that it happens to solve no problems is kind of beside the point. And on the other end, you have hackers who the joy they derive is the fact that they solved a problem. Never mind that it barely works and it'll probably not work the second time, but they actually did change an outcome in the world. And so you can see how this inherent, how do you tie these creative forces together so that you're solving problems in ways that are going to scale repeatably? I think the second part of it is we deeply believe that the sort of problems we want to go after in the world are power law. Like, the sorts of problems that you can solve by averaging all the requirements your customers have and synthesizing that into a roadmap. Those have mostly been done, and I'm not sure they're that valuable. Versus if you thought about it as some portion of my customers have a problem that is living in the future. They are way ahead of the rest of the market. And if I can deeply and thoroughly solve that problem for them, I will have built the fundamental infrastructure required to solve it for the rest of the market when they catch up. And one of the most profound examples of that is the vaccine distribution infrastructure that we built during COVID. We first built that for oil and gas. It produces $3 billion of incremental hydrocarbons a year. It's a digital twin from the seabed all the way to the petrol pump. Had we not built that 2 to 3 years before COVID happened, we wouldn't have been able to deliver in the UK and the US vaccine supply chains in a matter of weeks.
Sounds good, but I think many of my fellow CTOs here still have challenges with understanding like which part of the infrastructure you're building and which piece of the puzzle you're solving. And this maybe is also a good leads to our topic of like how you're going to deprecate backend in a few years. So maybe you explain that as well.
Well, I think the longer arc of Palantir is that we had to take responsibility for the full stack. And we kind of started at the top of the stack and worked our way down. So if you look at our reality today, we have roughly 150 independent dev teams building some collection of 5,000 microservices, some combination of which are deployed to 1,000 production environments, 100 of which are air-gapped. That means that we had to create, first, if you go to the very bottom of the stack at the production infrastructure layer, we had to create the necessary abstraction so that any one of these dev teams, any engineer in that team could be held operationally responsible for any of the 1,000 production environments. There's no SRE between you and prod. And so then I need to create an abstraction that allows you to not have to worry about the specifics of the environments at each one of these places. Then I need to automate the deployment. You're certainly not manually writing CI/CD pipelines for each of these 1,000 production environments for 5,000 microservices. So at the bottom of the stack, we created a bunch of technology that we've now brought to market and made available in Rubix and Apollo in particular. We think of it as like autonomous deployment. You have to go beyond just CI/CD to autonomous delivery of your software. Then as we go above that stack, we have Foundry, which allows you to kind of totally reinvent how you're thinking about how do I integrate data? How do I integrate my ability to write back and orchestrate with my existing transactional enterprise? Like I've never met really a greenfield enterprise customer. They all have extant investments that run their business today. And a successful strategy requires you to be able to quickly really connect to and manipulate and orchestrate them. And then above that, the kind of application layer, everything from low code tools that frontline factory workers can use in Hamburg as they're building the A320, all the way to pro code tools that React developers, data scientists who want to use Python, hardcore backend people who want to write in Java can leverage to build applications on top of.
So that means that you basically build some sort of an ORM initially and like move that to the browser and basically enable people to like create an ontology and logic on top of that, or?
That's right. I think the beating heart of what we do is the ontology, and we built it in the reverse order. Even though I described it bottoms up, because it's maybe more rational to look at it that way, the journey of developing it was the other way around, which is working backwards from our customers' problems to understand what infrastructure would we need to exist so that we could not only solve the day zero problem of delivering it, but the day two problems of maintaining it, evolving it, and transforming their enterprise as a consequence of it. You know, there's been so much historical emphasis, I'd say, over the last decade on the modern data stack and like, you know, data is the new oil. I feel like data is the new snake oil. It's close. It's like, it's not really, the data is not inherently valuable unless you're using it to make a decision. The decision is the critical part of the equation. How am I bringing more data surface area so that we're making better decisions? And how do I get into a continuous learning loop around those decisions? And then if you take one step back, obviously no decision is happening in isolation. This decision it constrains your optionality for decisions that are downstream of it. And it itself was constrained by decisions that are upstream of that. So you're living within a decision chain. And at some sort of gross level, if you kind of squint at every company, that's what they are. They are a decision chain. Some people call it a value chain, but you know, so how do I help you get better and better at that? And to really do that, you need to recognize the impedance mismatch between how your technology is organized. All these transactional systems are kind of optimized for how they want to store and manage data. But your enterprise, you have some sort of mental model as a human that we call the ontology of how you picture all of this stuff happening. You have to allow for the fact that model will change over time as your business evolves. Your own conception of what your business is changes. But you want to be able to actually operate at this digital twin level, at like how we as humans think of our business and what we're doing, and orchestrate and manipulate all your transactional systems as a consequence of that. So the ontology is like a logic layer. We've spent so much time building data warehouses. Maybe we need to build a logic warehouse. How do I create an abstraction layer that makes my entire business programmable? Like, here is the API for my business. I don't have to worry about the fact that actually, you know, I can just say, allocate inventory. That's a method call on an object for a product. And then underneath that, there are a series of SAP functions, maybe warehouse management system functions, other homegrown transactional systems that I need to call and orchestrate. I'd like to provide abstraction to the engineers who are driving my enterprise to think in the higher order concepts, to encapsulate security. You know, like, how do I make it as easy as possible for them to move as fast as possible safely in a way that I can govern at the ontology layer?
So that sounds like an ORM with finite state machines for each of the objects you store, with connections to every possible system out there. Is it that?
I think that's a good first approximation. Of course, you know, as anyone who creates something, you'd always bristle about you know, small differences here or there where we think we've kind of thought about it differently. But I think to a first approximation, that's a good way of thinking about it. But there's a heavy emphasis on the write. So I think with a lot of these systems, you get a lot of emphasis on the read. Like, how do I integrate this data so I can see myself? Great. The best you're going to be able to do with that is a dashboard. So if you have an insight you can't take an action on, what's the point? It's entirely academic. Instead, how do I build software that's actually going to be used at the factory floor, where people are making decisions? You know, and the fundamental pathology for most institutions is that there's a disconnect between what is happening in the boardroom and what is happening on the factory floor. And you try to solve that with layers of bureaucracy and middle management. And, you know, you're trying to like reduce complexity by dividing up the problem, but it's highly attenuated as a consequence. You lose a lot of the signal of what you're trying to do. So in the boardroom, they think they have a steering wheel for the enterprise. They're turning it, and they're somehow surprised that actually, you know, the ship is not moving at all. And that is a technology problem. One way of thinking about this is empirically, like COVID. Let's say in the 5 years leading up to COVID, how much did the world's enterprise companies spend on their IT systems? I mean, many, many billions of dollars. When COVID happened and their supply chains were disrupted, what could people point to and say, oh, I'm so glad I invested in this tech stack. It enabled us to weather this storm. I mean, I think by and large, the only thing people could point to was Zoom. How depressing. What an indictment of the software industry that we could not deliver resilient enough software for them to pivot to entirely new problems that were historically unforeseen. And I think that's what happens when you focus on the playbook of what is sellable instead of thinking about fundamentally what is valuable.
So what happened at Palantir when
our business went through the roof?
Apart from
I think, and to use the Buffett analogy, when the tide went out, you could see who was naked. And I think a lot of companies kind of scratched their head and said, like, why is none of this stuff working? Like, I have an exquisite ERP system. I'm so proud of how it's implemented, but somehow I have to shut down my factory because, a $5 wiring harness is no longer coming across the border from Ukraine or whatever the case might be. And I think it really poked holes at the seams between all of these systems and the inability to pivot your enterprise to new challenges and problems. This speaks to this divide. The other thing I think that we get pretty right at Palantir is this, most of the world is designed to solve problems deductively. Any problem you can solve by thinking top down. Someone has a little software point solution to go after. But what about all of the inductive problems? What about the things that you are either not knowable ex ante or can only be solved through iteration? That's what I think when we talk about the same way that hyperscalers provided us this abstraction to deprecate infrastructure, really. It's actually kind of hard to find young software engineers who know how to manage software on-prem, for example. They've forgotten all those skills. The abstraction is so beautiful, so clean. Well, I think we've built the necessary building blocks to deprecate backend development. And we've done that. Like, the right way to think about the infrastructure we've built is that these are highly opinionated building blocks. In the same way that a hyperscaler gives you highly unopinionated building blocks, which are great. You can build anything you want with them. It just might take you an extraordinary amount of time and effort. And the primitives are kind of at the infrastructure level that you have to reason with. We've given you highly opinionated building blocks. Like, a schedule is a first-class primitive that you can use and manipulate across all the applications, all the services in your ecosystem. Security is consistent throughout everything you're doing. So it liberates the developers. You don't have to think about the bare metal. Well, you don't have to think about your infrastructure. You don't think about auto-scaling. You don't have to think about security. You can instead focus on a declarative approach to backend. Let me just declare, here is the model that I essentially need. So not just the data model, but also the logic model, like how I'm going to do this. I can bring that, to use the MVC sort of framework, I can bring my own controllers. I can bring my containers to this orchestration engine. I can write my own logic in the platform in a serverless sort of way. And then I can very easily drive the view part of this, either through low code applications that are seamlessly integrated through ontology to everything I want to do in pro code. So if I want to build an entirely custom set of applications on top of this, you wouldn't even know that Palantir is backing it. In the same way, you wouldn't know that AWS is powering half the internet. We're providing that scaffolding.
So that means, like, in a few years from now, or maybe potentially now, I don't have to boot up Ruby on Rails whenever I start with a new idea, but rather call you or just use your interface because you gave me access.
Exactly. That you would just go to build.palantir.com and get your infrastructure to get going. And I think we're well on the journey. We've done a lot of this with enterprises. We're now very focused on bringing this to the broader market so that any company could get started on day zero building on top of this.
And how manageable is it? Often no-code solutions lead to, let's say, less complexity at the beginning and more complexity later on. I, for example, love Airtable at the beginning, and I hate it at the end. How is that?
I want it to be pro code. So we absolutely provide the low code tools because I think if you're being realistic, the factory floor worker is going to be developing solutions in low code, but we want them to be seamlessly interoperable. Whether you're building on low code or pro code, the applications you're building are going to work together because they're working on top of the common ontology. But we envision the developer platform being pro code. You're going to be building your React applications or your Python notebooks, really leveraging this backend.
And does that only deprecate backend development or also deprecate local development on your machine?
your IDE setup is like an extension of your mind. It is a bicycle for your mind. So I think a lot of development is still going to happen locally. And that's part of the art is making sure that dev experience is magical. The DevX really works. I think for some of these environments, it's actually much easier if we give you a hosted dev environment, which we do. So it's like in the context here, you can go, you can develop, it's connected seamlessly to the APIs. It has the the kind of test infrastructure loop you need to do this. So that's there. But we would never want to deprive you of a local dev environment.
So that means you can still use your own version control, etc., or is it all happening on Palantir servers?
No, you can use your own, but certainly we're just using Git, and we're making that easy for you. So if you don't want to go futz with it and set it up, yeah,
sure. Okay, and this is basically like accessible for startups, like digital native startups out there, like you mentioned YC, and that you're collaborating there, so everyone can just use it. It's not like purely for governmental organizations or like big enterprises.
Yeah, that's right. It's out there. There's probably on the order of 100 startups today that are using it. That are building. This is like really the core piece of technology infrastructure they're building around. And part of what I'm excited about is we're kind of making this more generally available and launching it so you can just come there, sign up, and get going.
So are you then also deprecating AWS long term, or?
In a sense, yes. Like we're not competing at the infrastructure level. We are running this on top of hyperscaler infrastructures. But at the application layer, like how are you building your backend? What are the backend services you're going to need? How much burden is there on you to operate these things? Versus actually you have a clean abstraction that allows you to deliver the applications you want.
So I don't have to build scaffolding anymore. I don't have to build like CRUD models, etc. I don't have to build the API itself. I don't have to build like, I don't know, the connection to LLMs. Like how does that look like?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So we bring all the LLMs to you. You can use them self-hosted. You can hit the common commercial ones in a very elegant integrated interface. We're going to keep building in that direction. We think with LLMs, the biggest problem is the bottleneck from prototype to production. And there's a whole tool chain that we're excited about releasing here that helps you manage that transition. So you can go from a very compelling, charismatic demo to something you can safely put into production to drive enterprise use cases. And that gives you some features around how do I auto-tune? How do I figure out what LLMs actually right for me on the cost performance curve? The difference between the most expensive model, which today is the highest end Anthropic model, and the cheapest but still most powerful open source model is about 1,000x. So there's going to be a lot of room for optimization and thinking about it. Well, yes, the cheapest way to prototype these things is with GPT-4o, but the cheapest way to deliver this in production is probably going to be very different.
And like building all this, like how do you prevent of being jack of all trades but master of none?
By maintaining a deep commitment to delivering the software for outcomes ourselves, right? So I think everything we built, we didn't build because we thought it was a good idea. We built because we had to build it to solve a huge problem out there in the world. And so that, I think, there's this empirical validation. We had to use this stuff in anger to deliver value for outcomes that we all depend on every day collectively. So from that, how do you synthesize the learnings? That is the essential inductive journey of what must exist that doesn't exist today. That's why we have so much conviction in what we have.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it really sounds cool. And to be honest, like you showed me a demo like for 1 hour and I was really like deeply impressed. So I think it really makes sense for folks here my listeners to check it out at build.palantir.com. Before we come to the like maybe your ideas on leadership, etc., are there any restrictions, any limitations? Like, can everyone just get started, or how does that work?
For complicated reasons, the complete self-service sign-up is available in the US, Canada, India, and the UK. It's coming to more countries quickly. If you're not in one of those countries and you'd like an account, you can get in touch with us and you'll get a free developer account through other means. But the self-service bit is right now in those core markets.
So you still have to build something for our market here, for Germany and for Europe, obviously. Yes. Coming from that, maybe to your ideas on leadership and how you actually what you learned on your way. I think one of your core principles is that you believe in meritocracy. Is that correct? Like,
highly. I mean, maybe even backing up, like the core talent philosophy at Palantir is that we want to be an artist colony, not a factory. I have no career ladder to offer anyone. I can give you no predictability in what the future is. But what I can tell you is that we are going to treat you as an individual, a unique human who has your own set of strengths and weaknesses. I'm never going to ask you to somehow be well-rounded or get better at your weaknesses. That's a waste of time. If you have superpowers like Superman, there's nothing you can do to somehow not get hurt by kryptonite other than to avoid it. So I want to create an environment that allows you to be honest about what you're not good at, not have to engage with those things, and instead to focus on your true superpowers, which is how I think you self-actualize. It's how you create the most impact in the world. And then continuing that sort of comic book metaphor, we get things done in teams. Like, how do I get the right sort of chemistry in the rock band so that the music, the jazz band sounds amazing? Right. So how do I, by enabling you to be like, look, this is really what I'm good at. This is my superpower. That's a journey of self-discovery. For lots of reasons, our classical education system pushes us to be well-rounded. It pushes us to try to do all these things. It also makes us think that the thing that we're good at must be hard for us to do. Otherwise, it doesn't seem that like intellectually rewarding. But actually, often the things that we're world-class at are intuitive. They're native to us. They happen at some deeper level in our brain. And I think there's a journey especially for early talent, to discover, well, what really is that? And part of that is observing it observationally, because you look at it and you see, wow, this thing was really easy for me, but everyone else is kind of struggling with this. And that's indicative of an area that you have unique strength. So let's start there and say, how do I create an artist colony that rewards that sort of behavior, that allows people to I'm not trying to fit you into a role. I'm actually developing a role around you. And then how do I wield that throughout the organization to go then deliver maximum impact out there in the world? So when you start there, you have to be meritocratic, right? Like the whole point is you're developing people based on who they are. And then a lot of things come as a consequence of that. Like, how would you organize yourself? Well, there's no consistency, actually, because almost everything is itself bespoke. You want to build the right team. You want to organize around the problems that you're actually facing. And I think there's a way in which the right org structure is quantum. Is it a wave? Is it a particle? I don't know. It depends at your moment of observation. Is it flat? Is it hierarchical? It's like to the point of the opposite of one mistake is another mistake. I think a perfectly flat org structure seems like complete chaos. Perfectly hierarchical structure is locked in and sclerotic and won't adapt to meet its moment. The question is how malleable is it to fit the moment? And your ability to reorganize around a problem is indicative of how flat it would be. And, is your institution the sort of place that could tolerate having the person who's been here 3 months being in charge of someone who's been here 3 years? I think that's one of the central strengths.
And how do you ensure that you reward the right people, the right talents, and the right behavior? And how do you actually measure the right behavior?
It's really hard. I think a lot of it is qualitative. So on the reward side, the fundamental reward that you're signing up for is getting to work on bigger and bigger problems, having more and more impact. There's a human piece of this where humans they're thinking, how do I communicate my progress to people outside the company, to my family, to myself? And they're wrestling with that so that you kind of come to terms with, like, my progress is really about how good do I feel about my work? And when I look at the things in the world that I'm powering, how much joy do I get out of that? How rewarding is that? In terms of measuring it, I think it is highly qualitative.
And how can you still make sure that you're getting the right amount of like diversity and especially like diversity in thoughts? Let's look at that. Like, how do you make sure you have that set in this culture?
You need to have enough entropy. So I think one of the good thing when you bias towards flatness, you can't overmanage things. Actually, lots of things are happening. There's lots of people with heterodox ideas. So one of the things that we encourage is rebellion. So yes, I have opinions of where I want the product to go, but I also empower you to tell me to fuck off. It's actually the first thing I tell at every AMA with new hires. I make them practice telling me to my face to fuck off out loud. Because if you're not willing to do that, it's not actually a flat company. And so I want you to prove me wrong where I'm wrong. Like, of course I have strong convictions, but I'm not going to stop you from going out there and developing heterodox ideas. And that's how you ensure that there's enough space and enough room and creativity. I think a lot of creativity comes from that sort of process of saying, like, I know this is wrong. I want to go prove it. I want to go do this. And having a culture that encourages that rather than tries to sequester that or tries to stamp out, we're fundamentally looking for the heretics, looking for the heterodox people.
And how does that look like on a hierarchy level? Like which kind of roles do you have, and where do people report, and how flat is your hierarchy?
It's pretty flat. I mean, I think to most people, our org structure makes no sense. At some point, we had root nodes. I really like that concept. There were people who like didn't report to. You couldn't. There was not one node at the top of the tree. There was just multiple nodes, and it made no sense. And I think part of that is getting people to not look at that too seriously. Like, how can you maximally? There's some things that you're going to need a little bit of hierarchy to make easier, and whether it's like a review process or who do I go when I have something confusing. But if you're really looking at the creative process, hierarchy just gets in the way. So when you're doing the creative work, that process you want it to feel completely flat. And I think you kind of get over the entropy. There is a human bias towards hierarchy and structure and organization, and that's why you have to also find some way of institutionalizing rebellion. It's in the Hindu tradition. There's three roles of the god. They call it the Trimurti. There's creation, there's maintenance, let's call it O&M, and there's destruction. And the only way to deal with all this entropy you accumulate over time is to destroy it. You need this process of tearing down the things you built in the past to rebuild them. It's a loop. And I think there's a lot of wisdom. I'm not a religious person, but there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Yeah, that really is a cool idea. So I have to admit, but on the I find it hard to really see how it's practically working and how you ensure that there is flow. I really believe in natural flow, and hierarchies often standing in the way of flow. How do you ensure that you have a constant flow in a not very hierarchical organization where you even encourage people to stand up or to rebel?
Well, the first step is driving transparency and communications. So it's almost like a starting condition. Is you really want aspire for organization where wherever you are, you can know what's going on. It's knowable. Now there's a second question of filter failure where that can be overwhelming, but you don't have to fight for access to what's happening here or there, or how do I have as much information as possible so that I'm on a level playing field when I'm making decisions. I'm fully informed. That's step one. And there's lots of ways you can do it. Like you can think about broadcast comms are probably one of our core secrets. If something's happening, there's kind of an expectation that you're going to write it up so that everyone who wants to have access to it can say, I now know what's going on here. So that reduces the information asymmetry, which becomes one of the unofficial ways that hierarchy gets propagated. Forget about what's in the org structure. It's when the org structure starts mapping to the information flow structure that you start having lots of pathologies. If you just said, look, as a thought experiment, everyone's going to know everything at all times, I think you would find the org structure matters substantially less than anything, right? Okay, so now if you start addressing problems of information flow, then it's how do you organize the work units? And so how do you get the people who can solve the problems next to the problem, and then get out of the way? There's some. I think a great part of the decay of our ability to do things in the West is a function of over managing things. How is it that we started the Inflation Reduction Act and we somehow have 8 chargers after spending $8 billion? It's just all overmanaged. Or, Elon put 300 plus rockets into orbit for $9.6 billion, and California spent $11 billion to build 1,600 feet of elevated rail, right? It's just where is the effort going? Are you getting the engineers next to the problem, then getting out of the way? And that can be very scary because it's not managed, it's not controlled. There's going to be variance in the outcome. Some of these things will be a disaster. Some of them are going to be truly spectacular. But if you constrain the variance, that means sure, you probably have less disasters. You also don't have anything exceptional that comes out of that process. So how do you kind of lean into that authentic reality? And then you have to go get the best people, and you have to empower them. And you have to kind of, the metaphor I use is you don't turn into the Incredible Hulk by lifting a little bit more weight every single day, right? There have to be these crucibles that you go through, this blast of gamma radiation that might have killed you. Maybe it was a 50% chance you're going to survive that experience. But if you do survive it, you're going to have learned an enormous amount. And you can't make up for that. So how do I continually maximize putting my people in a position that grows them. And I remind them that your position of maximum growth is also likely a position of maximum pain. Like no one is telling you this is going to be a pleasant journey, but it is going to be rewarding.
Well, and if you like have the right intuition, then it can be also like rewarding and not so painful, right? As said.
Yeah. Look, there's Greg LeMond, a famous cyclist. He said, it doesn't get easier. You just go faster. So I think one of the pathologies you kind of see over time is like we continuously look at the experience we went through, we reflect on it, and we say, how can we make that less painful? And there's a very fine line between what's a medicine and what's an opioid in that reflection. What actually, by blunting the pain, ensures you will not get to the outcome? Like what part of that pain was necessary to the journey, and what part of that pain was superfluous? Certainly, there's often superfluous pain. I'm just saying it requires a scalpel to really think diligently about where am I blunting the outcome versus actually creating efficiency.
Right. Like I like your thoughts. I'm not sure if it can be applied to every organization out there, and it seriously means like rethinking how you structure. When did you start with that? Like, is that like from the start? Did you set the values and then like you just went for it, or was there like a fundamental shift when you thought, oh, we have to change this? Like this is too bureaucratic, this is too hierarchical, or like what was your moment of shifting?
I mean, I think we were blessed with starting with kind of this kind of contrarian culture, and Alex really enforced it. I would say to the point of entropy, though, like there is this human desire for predictability and structure. So at various times, I feel like we've accumulated structure we've had to tear down. And I've never met a structure we tore down that I didn't really appreciate tearing. When you're looking at the abyss and you're like, but here are all the things we're getting out of this structure. It seems so comforting. It seems like there's so much loss aversion, but actually then in tearing it down and reinventing it, it only becomes strictly positive.
As initially said, you're working with many big leaders from tech and like people like, I don't know, Satya Nadella, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, etc., Alex Karp, obviously. Like, who was the most influential person of those, or like even more I didn't mention, and why did they influence you so much?
Wow, that's a tough question. I feel like I've learned so much from all of these folks, and I'm constantly trying to absorb their mental models and see how you would apply them. But if you're looking narrowly in the context of Palantir, it'd be hard to escape the enormous impact that both Alex and Peter have had in terms of how we all think about everything that we're doing every day. And it's motivationally too. It's like reminding us to stay true to that painful journey of discovering secrets that are out there, of not absorbing the comfortable playbook that everyone else is doing, of looking completely crazy, managing to be misunderstood and having confidence in what it is that you're actually doing. But there have been many people along that journey where you absorb deep lessons. From before my time at Palantir, people like Keith Raboy and Roloff Botha, when I was at Zoom, all the way to the present moment, looking at the customers we're actually working with and how they think about problems. It's actually really, we spend all of our time, the creative work we do is around bits, but the 50% of our business that's commercial is about helping our customers bend metal. It's about atoms and recognizing that the very physical world that I think inside of technology companies, or particularly inside of the Valley, you kind of forget about the rest of the world that really exists and how crucial it is in this moment. And that's led us to invest a great deal in reindustrialization broadly, a theme. Arguably, Germany doesn't have to reindustrialize, but it's an opportunity to keep going with industrial and its industrial might. But the West broadly does need to reindustrialize, and it's unlikely that we're gonna drive that industrialization the way we did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We have unique strengths in software, and we're going to have to think about how do we do software-defined production. And we have unique strengths with AI that we are the leading labs in the world. We are doing the interesting work. How do we leverage that to drive the physical economy? I think is one of the most interesting challenges right now.
And that's like one of the bigger things that still needs to be solved, right? Like, how do we move AI in the middle of everything, and actually, how can we trust it enough to derive actions from it, right? What was your last, let's say, game changer move in personal productivity. Is there something you can recommend to all of my listeners? Like something that made you way more productive in the last months or years?
Yeah, actually, in the last year, I recommitted myself to having a small number of things I drive as an individual contributor. And you can't do that for everything, obviously, as time goes on. But there's an immense amount of value in being so deep in the details on a specific set of projects that you actually have to be part of the creation process. And the kind of inductive dots that gives you on how you can apply that against the broader portfolio. So I think it's a real mistake to get to the point where all you're doing is managing a bunch of things, managing priorities, thinking, pretty abstractly in the high level. And so finding some way of being connected to at least one project that you are deeply in the weeds on, I think makes you better at everything else. It sounds counterintuitive, and I think people resist it because of context switching. Like the context switching is very hard at different levels of abstraction, but it's worth it because of how much more productive you are.
Shyam, thanks a lot. Coming to my outro question, so I still have a little surprise for you. Alex Karp told me about a secret Easter egg in the core of Palantir, in the deepest core of Palantir, and a secret that he doesn't tell many people. It is actually a functionality that's called Time Machine, and it actually helps you to travel in time and travel back in time, or also forward in time. And I actually applied it on the instance that you gave me in AAP and build.palantir.com. And with my newly built model, we can travel back in time in your life to the time you worked as a developer at Zero Chaos in the year 2000. And you now have the chance to whisper something into young Shyam's ears. What would it be?
Focus on your strengths. Go figure out what your superpowers are. Don't worry about the rest of the world, right? It's really all the value comes from the internal creative process and knowing who you are, not on being what you think the world needs you to be. That's my simple advice.
That's a good advice. Thanks a lot, Shyam, for being my guest here. And yeah, to all the people listening, check out build.palantir.com. And I can even connect you to the folks at Palantir. Don't hesitate to reach out so that you get a proper EU instance, right?
That's right.
So yeah, thanks a lot for being my guest, and I hope I can actually meet you in real life, because the Wi-Fi was so shitty in today's recording. Excuse for that. So whenever I travel over, I'll ping you.
Yeah, my apologies on that. Well, yeah, we should do some sort of physical developer event in Germany. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do that. Thanks a lot, Shyam, and let's meet up.
All right. Thank you, Tobias.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you liked this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about, or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.